LOL take two. LOL take two. LOL take two. Now listen. Travelopathy. No, it's not a real word. I just made it up. I was on one of my walks, and the idea came to me, as they often do on my walks. And sadly, I immediately have to say, Siri, set a reminder about this idea I just had. Okay, I'll remind you. Lady Siri sounds too cranky, so I have the British guy set. According to the dictionary, pathy, added onto a word, derives from the Greek word pathia, or pathos, which means feeling, sometimes suffering, or clinically it can be a curative treatment, as in hydropathy. So, travelopathy, the new word I just invented, is a curative treatment for when life gets you down, for when you need to shake things up, for when you need to run away and see if the grass is indeed greener. And don't bother, somebody already owns the domain name. Mankind, it seems, has always had travelopathy. If they hadn't, we'd all still be living in Southeast Africa, where we all came from, and it would no doubt be really crowded with Homo sapiens. But fortunately, the homosexual sapiens would probably be doing fabulous productions of The Lion King with all that beautiful, natural savanna light. But no, thankfully, our ancestors had travelopathy and scattered throughout the world. Growing up in landlocked Iowa with its rolling prairies and spectacular sunsets was nice, but I always had the itch to go elsewhere, and we didn't have a lot of money for vacations when I was young. The first real one I remember was when I was 4 years old. Mom and Dad packed up my 2-year-old sister and me in our blue Rambler, and we made the 3-day drive to California. Having driven that same trip out to California when I was 23 made me appreciate the pioneer spirit my folks had in the summer of 1967. It was July. It was hot. We had no air conditioning or radio. It was so rustic, in fact, the only thing we were missing was a wagon train and my mom in a Laura Ingalls Wilder bonnet. We stayed at roadside motels along the way, and one night in Tucumcari, New Mexico, my sister and I had to take a bath together. I guess it was my mom's way of multitasking and getting 2 stinky kids bathed in the time it took to bathe 1 stinky kid. We were little kids, so we didn't care. Until my sister pooped in the bathtub, and I remember screaming and climbing up on the side of the tub to avoid contact with the floating Lincoln logs. It was just hideous. We stayed with relatives once we were in L.A. My dad documented the trip on Super 8 home movies, and it was always one of my favorite 30-minute reels to watch. We went to Hollywood and the Chinese Theater, Knott's Berry Farm, and, of course, Disneyland, which was magical. I got the It's a Small World record and played it over and over again until the relatives we were staying with were ready to pop me. Hey, it was catchy, and it had a good message. Our vacations after that were pretty tame. We drove to other towns, Sioux City, Kansas City, and even Houston, Texas, and stayed with relatives. I was always jealous of my cousins on my mom's side, as they were the perfect family. They were rich, they didn't poop in the tub, and they always took amazing vacations to places like dude ranches. Now, I had no idea what a dude ranch was. Was it a place where you rode horses and said dude a lot? But I was so envious we couldn't stay at one and had to sleep on relatives' floors in sleeping bags on our vacations. After my dad left Montgomery Ward and became a salesman, he and his salesman friends pooled their samples and had sample sales. My mom sent out postcards to advertise, and for an entire weekend, twice a year, our basement looked like Macy's on Black Friday. It was full of half-clothed men trying on samples and making purchases from my mom, who had a cigarette in one hand and her other hand on the money box. Mom would hide all the cash in our freezer while my folks went out to dinner to celebrate. These sample sales really helped the household bottom line, and we began to take more fancy lakeside vacations in Minnesota. Those vacations at places like Isle o' Dreams were a blast. Each cabin came with a boat, and sometimes our other cousins would join us. We kids were on our own and took part in all kinds of shenanigans during the week. I would, of course, organize shows for talent night and bring my Super 8 camera and make movies. My little brother Timmy and our cousin Matthew would go to the resort laundry room, which was in the basement of one of the larger cabins, put empty Schlitz cans in the dryer, turn it on and run, the beer cans banging away and waking everybody up. My cousin Suzanne even lost her virginity during one of those weeks. Ah, good times. Alas, Midwest lakes are not the ocean. Back in Des Moines, I was making one of my movies, Murder is the Latest Fashion. In one scene, the evil Madam X sets out to kill two brothers who are heirs to a fashion empire by tying them up at low tide and letting the high tide drown them. My best friend Tony and I played the brothers, and our friend Regina was Madam X. And since we had no ocean or tides, we shot the scene at Sailorville Lake and kept moving further out as Madam X watches on. Thankfully, we are rescued by two detectives played by my sister Robin and our friend Janet, who find us drowning, strip down to bikinis to rescue us. Then Robin chases Madam X down the beach where they have a girl-on-girl beatdown, and eventually Madam X jumps off a cliff to her death. It was all very dramatic. I didn't get to see a real ocean until my first trip on a plane, senior year in high school, when Tony and I went to New York City. Times Square in 1980 was seedy, dirty, and filled with all kinds of porno palaces. In a word, it was heaven. Everything was so different from anything we had ever experienced in Iowa. The people, the topography, a real ocean. It changed me and lit my Travelopathy fire forever. Thankfully, Bill and I both share the Travelopathy gene and began seeing the world whenever we could save up enough money for a trip. I remember early in our relationship, I was still paying off my college loans and trying to start a career in show business. I was really torn about spending money on a big trip to England and France. I had lunch with my favorite uncle who was visiting from Iowa. I told him my dilemma, and he advised me to just dive in and take the trip. It would all work out. I took his advice. I remember flying into London as the sun rose and bursting into tears because it looked just like the opening scene from Mary Poppins. We were on a train back from Shakespeare's hometown, Stratford-upon-Avon, and this awful couple from Texas was griping to us. "We were just in Stratford-upon-Avon, too, and they would not let me take a picture of a chair. I said I'm an interior decorator, and they still would not let me do it. Well, you know their standards are so beneath ours." Really, lady? Bill and I went to the cafe car and never returned to our seats next to these ethnocentristic yahoos. We were in Mont-Saint-Michel in France and had traveled up the hill of the famous monastery that turns into an island when the tides come in. Where was Madame X when we needed her? It was an early morning, and our French tour guide had unwashed, slept-on hair, pulled back with a pink headband. The hordes of poorly behaved tourists were not paying attention, and when one asked a duplicate question, our frustrated guide snapped at him and said, "I told you." Bill and I have been quoting her for decades. That trip was magical. And 2 months later, my Uncle Tom was killed in a car accident at 45 years old. I'm glad I had taken the trip. I think of that every time I am on the fence about putting off a trip. How many places would Uncle Tom have visited in the 25 years since he was gone? A Travelopathy lesson learned the sad way. So Bill and I jumped in, time and time again. Ireland, Egypt, Brazil, Sweden, Peru, Spain, and on and on. Now everybody loves complaining about millennials, and I can be just as cranky as the next middle-aged curmudgeon. Get off my lawn, you little Snapchat instant gratification bastards. When I think about how I was at their age, though, I have to admit I paid little attention to anything else either, except my huge 80s hair, watching Dynasty every Wednesday, and worrying about getting laid. One of the hallmarks of the millennial experience is that they would rather experience stuff than accumulate stuff. That's why you see a ton of them traveling. And why not? You don't even need a lot of money to fly anymore. You can get somewhere for cheap if you're prepared to spend 10 hours in the birthing position. Hell, our mothers did it. Why can't we? As I get older, I find I need less and less stuff. To be honest, I just don't have the room. But it's more than that. Several years ago, my mom's basement flooded and all the stuff under her stairs, boxes my brother, sister, and I had stored there, were soaking wet. This was stuff I had forgotten I owned to begin with, and Mom started throwing it out. My brother jumped in and talked my mom out of tossing my box of Super 8 film snippets, a People magazine from 1976 with Charlie's Angels on it, and a pair of clogs from my early high school years. I don't know what possessed me to buy clogs in the first place, except that we had a priest who wore them, and ABBA wore them. They added 3 inches to my 6-foot 1-inch height. I mistakenly wore them to Urbandale High School one day, and from then on they were only worn at home, and rarely. And 40 years later, here they were, covered in mold from the flood. I said goodbye and threw them in the trash. Recently, Bill and some friends from a show they had been in had a mini reunion in Las Vegas where one of the friends lived. She hosted, and the 4 of them spent 3 days picking right back up where they left off. They had a blast. They said goodbye on a Wednesday with promises to get together again, not waiting another 49 years. Bill got a message from the Las Vegas woman's husband on Saturday. She had died of a massive heart attack, and she was the youngest and skinniest one of the group. They were so glad they hadn't put off the reunion. I didn't even know her, but was blown away at the Travelopathy lesson hitting home yet again. Go for the experiences, because really, at the end of our lives, what do we remember? All the time we spent at the office? Time spent stressing or being angry? No. It's the peak experiences, and Travelopathy is a shortcut to peak experiences. So hold off on buying stuff and get that ticket. See some place you've always dreamed about where you don't speak the language. That's out of your comfort zone. Because let's face it, you're going to wear the ABBA clogs once, the basement's going to flood, and they're going to end up in the trash. Life can take your ABBA clogs from you, but it can't take your peak experiences. I told you it really is a small world after all. LOL take 2. LOL take 2. LOL take 2.